Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Baer, Dean, UW College of Forest Resources. On behalf of the college, I wish to welcome all of you to this three-part lecture series entitled Sustaining Our Northwest World, From Fire to Flowers. Our intent in the series is to highlight the dynamic balance we seek in meeting the growing natural resource needs of society while sustaining the environmental, economic, and cultural values we associate with our urban and wildland resources. This lecture series is a companion to the college's Denman Forestry Issue series, also seen on UW-TV, and both series contribute to the college's vision of world-class leadership in sustaining natural resources and environmental services throughout the region in order to improve the lives of future generations while satisfying the needs of people today. Most natural resource decisions are complex and oftentimes contentious. Thus, good solutions require that objective science be used to weigh the ecological, social, and economic consequences of decisions in order to meet the desired balanced result. All three values must be considered to achieve sustainability and to ensure the proper stewardship of our natural resources. We are pleased to present this lecture series as a partnership between the University of Washington Alumni Association and the College of Forest Resources. We are also grateful for the support of the Rachel A. Woods Endowment, which is underwriting a portion of this series, and to the members of the college's Dean's Club for their financial support. I encourage you to contact the college at www.cfr.washington.edu to explore the broad nature of natural resources and to learn how our college plans to educate the next generation of natural resource scientists and leaders while creating and leveraging new technology to sustain the social, ecological, and economic values of our Northwest world. Managing forests to promote more aesthetically pleasing landscapes is the topic of today's lecture. Our speaker, Dr. Gordon Bradley, raises the question, do forest planners and policymakers have an obligation to make decisions more compatible with people's aesthetic needs, and if so, are there ways to foster participation to ensure that these concerns are met? Many land use and growth management requirements faced by forest landowners focus on economic, ecological, and other welfare considerations, but usually do not focus specifically on aesthetic issues. Growing scientific evidence suggests, however, that there are ways to manage our forests to enhance the visual resource. At issue is the willingness of landowners to accept the trade-offs inherent in seeking the balance required to meet aesthetic objectives while also producing sustainable forests. Closely related is the societal debate over whether increasing regulations or a market-based approach involving economic incentives is the most efficient and effective means to achieve this end. With us today to present his vision for forest management practices that are intended to incorporate the visual resource while seeking to produce sustainable forest is Dr. Gordon Bradley, a nationally recognized expert of forest planning and a professor at the UW College of Forest Resources. The title of his talk is Who Shapes the Visual Landscape and Does It Matter?
I'd like to thank Paul and the University of Washington Alumni Association and the College of Forest Resources for organizing this lecture series and for the support for this evening's program. And throughout my comments this evening, I may from time to time refer to the work we have done, and seldom are the kinds of projects that I will be talking about this evening are the individual efforts. So the we I'm referring to are some of those people that I have collaborated with on these projects, and not all of them could be here this evening, but I know a couple of them are. Jenna Tilt is here, as is Ara Erickson, and I'll give the presentation and then they can answer the questions at the end of the session. We often hear the term beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, and more often than not, when I hear that phrase, it's a reason for not addressing visual resource management issues. After all, beauty's in the eyes of the beholder, so there's little we can do about managing visual resources since it's presumably such an individual thing. However, this evening, what we'll discover before we're done is that indeed we all share a fairly common understanding of those landscapes we like and those landscapes that we do not like. And it's our hope that those preferences for landscapes we like find their way into our various land use plans and programs. The kinds of landscapes that we'll be talking about tonight when we talk about what is the visual landscape, there'll be those rural kinds of landscapes that we see around western Washington. They'll include a discussion of those working forest landscapes, landscapes that are largely managed by the Department of Natural Resources or by large timber companies. They'll also include scenic landscapes, and those landscapes you would view from the road in scenes such as this, or shorelines that you would see from the lake. So for the purpose of our discussion tonight, what is the visual landscape? These are the kinds of landscapes that we'll be talking about, and in fact were the focus of some of the projects that we have worked on. Why is the visual landscape important? Well, we could spend the whole evening talking about that, but just for the purpose of this evening's discussion, it's useful to point out that a visually pleasing landscape adds considerable value to a property, a residential property, or a large landscape. A visually pleasing landscape contributes to the identity of the community and the well-being of the residents that live in those communities. The visually pleasing landscape is probably what attracts us to those kinds of places that we go to for our favorite recreation destinations and provide those kinds of restorative environments that we're after to get away from some of our urban pressures. And finally, an orderly, visually pleasing working forest landscape to many suggests that the land is being well tended, that the management practices exhibit good stewardship. So that's why, in part, the visual landscape is important. It's important for economic reasons, social reasons, psychological reasons, and the good intentions of management of our land management organizations. Well, what I want to talk about this evening then, in terms of these kinds of landscapes, I want to talk about 3 examples where the visual landscape is an explicit part of the program objective of these particular efforts. The first one is and I want to focus on ones where the actual visual objective is a part of the program, so that where you don't have to worry about well, should we even consider whether visual visual quality is important in our land use plans. Here we have 3 examples where the visual resource management objective is an explicit part of the program. And these are state programs, local programs, a federal program, and one that basically is on private land. So we can see where these kinds of objectives might find their way in a variety of these kinds of programs. The first one is the Washington State Growth Management Act. And this was passed in 1990 here in the state of Washington by the state legislature. So the state legislature thought that this was important. One of the provisions in the Growth Management Act, when those counties that plan under the Growth Management Act and developing comprehensive plans, they should address this question of rural character in those plans. So the legislature says it's important. The county planners then implement that in their comprehensive plans, and you and I presumably benefit by those provisions as we drive around the rural landscapes of Washington. The second example that we'll be talking about has to do with the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. Now, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative is an initiative of the American Forest and Paper Association. AF&PA is a private association whose members include large timberland owners. Those that would be familiar to us in the state of Washington include companies such as Weyerhaeuser, Plum Creek, Hancock Resources, Rainier Timber, ones that are probably familiar to all of you. Okay? The SFI program is one that these companies subscribe to because if they meet all of the objectives of the program, then their lands become certified. And when those lands become certified, then that gives them greater credibility as stewards of those lands and maybe at some future date opportunities for greater marketability of their products. The point here is that one of the objectives of SFI deals with visual resource management. So again, remember we have the policy people within that agency saying to implement this objective, we want the foresters in the field to develop programs implementing that objective. So presumably, you and I, when we drive around the state of Washington and we see some of these working for us, then indeed the visual effects have been addressed. The third example is the Lake Tahoe Regional Plan. This plan was developed by the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. This agency was established in 1970 by an act of Congress, so we have the Congress deciding that that the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency will develop a land use plan addressing land use and environmental issues. A part of that is to address the scenery of that particular area. Congress has the goal, the planners of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency implement that goal, and then we have you and I, presumably, when we visit Lake Tahoe, we will enjoy that scenery. Now, some of you might wonder, how come we're talking about the Northwest and how Lake Tahoe will get in there? Well, it's like a lot, if we were in Albuquerque, it would probably be kind of in the Northwest. So I've stretched things a little bit, and this was, it tells a nice story. So Lake Tahoe is in the Northwest this evening, okay? So now this is important to remember now, because this is kind of the theme that runs through our discussion this evening. We have the policymakers that say this is important. We have those that are implement the policy, and then we have those of us out there that are going to presumably benefit from this. And so that raises the question, who shapes the visual landscape and why it may matter? Okay, we have the policymaker, the implementer, and the beneficiary. The ideal world, of course, would be if we're all out there in the woods together and we have the same image of what this would be. Sometimes that is not always the case, and this is why it may matter. So the fellow on the left thinks he is the policymaker and has something in mind. It's probably, in all likelihood, the bear in the middle is going to implement the policy, and you and I are going to get leftovers whether we like them or not, okay? Whether they're our preferred leftover. And so what we would hope in each of these different programs is that the policies, the goals of those programs are successfully implemented in a way so that those things that we see in the landscape are indeed those things that we prefer. So let's begin with, and we'll go through each of these case studies then and talk about what it is that was done and what we know about the relationship between the policy, the implementation, and presumably the beneficiaries. In the case of the Washington State Growth Management Act, as I mentioned, there's the rural character provision within that legislation. And we looked at, in this particular case, the King County Comprehensive Plan. In that rural element, it says, rural character refers to the patterns of land use and development established by a county in the rural element of its comprehensive plan. And what we were interested in was how different people perceive the idea of rural character. This was largely Jenna's project and Ann Carney working on this particular one. And essentially what we did was to survey the rural residents, county planners, and urban recreationists. We were showing them images of scenes from an aerial perspective as well as what you would see from the road, and asking them to what extent they thought that these images exhibited rural character. We also asked them just verbally to describe those characteristics that they thought would be associated with environments that were showing or demonstrated kind of qualities of rural character. So what we found out was that planners have traditionally focused on density as a way of getting at this idea of rural character. And this isn't unique to King County or to Washington. If you look at studies that have been done around the country where they're addressing these issues of rural character, oftentimes density is the way that they go at it. And so that means that in these certain zones where they're trying to achieve this rural character, they'll zone it as 5, 10, 20, 40, 80 acre lot size. So you have the development spread out, and presumably spread out development results in rural character. So you would have scenes like this, that very low density development out in the woods, and presumably this is rural character. Now, interestingly enough, what we find is that the rural residents, when they're queried on this, they conceptualize rural character as a kind of place that exhibits a sense of community and a quality of life. And in fact, many of their comments were devoid of any notion of density. And so you would see places such as this, that it has a very ruralness to it, farm buildings, pastures, those kinds of things. And in this particular case, we have the pink house that may be low in density, but does not necessarily speak to ruralness. The farm scene does that by exhibiting qualities that suggest it's a working rural farm. And interestingly enough, we have a situation where we have a scene that's rated high in rural character, and you can see it's relatively, it's a higher density. So we see that in fact density by itself may not be a determining factor in people's perception of what is rural character. I mean, when we look closely at the pink house, there's no rural use evident. It's a large lawn, looks suburban, new building, big garage, suggests a commute that you're not even staying around very long. You're going into the city. You can't see your neighbors over the next pasture or through the woods. The farm, on the other hand, you can see your neighbors' buildings. Property is obviously used for rural purposes. You can see the farm equipment, the silo, the barn. And in the residential scene, this happens to be some houses in Cle Elum. It's a small town, looks like old houses, quaint, tree-lined walk, rustic fence, porches. Looks like the place you could get to know your neighbors and visit with your neighbors. So what is it about rural character then that we need to pay attention to in this particular case? In this case, the legislature felt it was important in developing comprehensive plans that rural character be addressed in these plans. The way that planners have often operationalized the idea of rural character may not entirely capture what it is that rural residents actually perceive as the rural character of the countryside. So in these cases, it becomes extremely important for planners to tap the community's sense of what constitutes rural character, if indeed they are intending to successfully implement the provisions of the Growth Management Act. It is also important to note that, as we discovered in this work, visual surveys, at least in part, can be a fairly effective tool in tapping the residents' perceptions of rural character. So that's our first case. We have the policy, we have the planners, and we have you and I. And you can see that there's a few differences in there, and we need to pay attention to those if we are going to be successful in making some semblance of consistency among those three levels of development of kind of our visual landscape. Let's go to our next case, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. And as I mentioned, this is a program of the American Forest and Paper Association. And the actual language associated with the Sustainable Forestry Initiative calls for a land stewardship ethic which integrates the reforestation, nurturing, and harvesting of trees for useful products with the conservation of soil, air, and water resources, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, and forest aesthetics. And as I mentioned, one objective speaks specifically to the idea of visual resource management. Objective 5 talks about managing the visual impact of harvesting and other forestry operations. Now this initiative was adopted in 1994, and so they've had some time now to be working on it. But it isn't the first time that forestry and aesthetics have kind of come together in working on our working landscapes. And I like to sort of take an aside here because I think this is kind of interesting, because oftentimes in forestry we think that this whole idea of paying attention to visual resources is new. Indeed, it goes back to the very origins of forestry in the United States, and that was at the Biltmore Estate. If any of you have had the opportunity to visit the Biltmore Estate, it's in Asheville, North Carolina. It is the largest private residence in the United States. It was built by George Vanderbilt, and the property that he had associated with this estate was a couple 100,000 acres of forest and farmland in North Carolina. Well, that's a lot of property to try and figure out what it is that you're going to do with. And so what he did was to hire a land use planner to help him out. And the land use planner in this particular case was Frederick Law Olmsted. You don't know anything small, okay? Big house, and you go right to the main guy. And Frederick Law Olmsted, as you know, was the designer of Central Park, and it was the Olmsted office that actually laid out the green print here in Seattle. So as you go from Seward Park up Lake Washington Boulevard through the Arboretum, the UW campus, Ravenna Boulevard, Green Lake, this is all part of the green print that was laid out by the Olmsted office back at the turn of the century here in Seattle. I think it was 1910 or 11. Okay? In any event, Frederick Law Olmsted then is working with George Vanderbilt, and what he says to George Vanderbilt, he says, we have a tremendous opportunity here to begin the managing your landscape as a scientifically managed working forest. And so who should he call to help him? Gifford Pinchot. So Gifford Pinchot and Frederick Law Olmsted team up together to work on the Biltmore Estate for George Vanderbilt to create these working landscapes. And what we end up with then is landscapes for agriculture, for forestry, and we have some of the most aesthetically pleasing landscapes in the country. To this day, when people talk about aesthetically pleasing landscapes, they talk about this entry into the Biltmore Estate. So this is a good example of the fact that indeed aesthetics and forestry go back to the very origins of forestry as it was established here at the Biltmore Estate. And in fact, the Biltmore Forestry School, the first forestry school, was established right at this point. Just an interesting aside, I think. So now we're back to this idea of we have a sustainable forestry initiative, and we have a goal set by the policy board of AF&PA, and now the foresters in the woods are going to implement this objective, and you and I are presumably going to benefit. Well, what we have been doing over the course of the last 8 years is we have been doing some studies on the Capitol Forest, which is Department of Natural Resources administered land down near Olympia, Washington. And what it is that we have done there is that we have 3 plots that have been set up, and they look kind of like this. It's in a second growth Douglas fir forest, so these are about 70-year-old trees. The area has been divided up into different plots. So we have one that we call a patch cut, one that's a group selection, a thin, a control, a clear cut, and a 2-age. And the little computer simulation, this is what they look like. If it's a control, all the trees are left. If it's a clear cut, they're all gone. If it's a commercial thin, about 25% of the trees are gone. We have the 2-age, where about 80% of the trees are gone. The patch cut has these larger openings from 1.5 to 5 acres, and then the group selection is these distributed openings of about 1.5 acres. All around the openings, they have commercially thinned the forest, so it has kind of this same texture here. Now, what we have done for the last 8 years is that we go out into the forest, and it's after things have leafed out, before they fall color, so it's in the summer. We like to try and do this where it's a sunny day where you have a blue sky. You can capture what it is that's going on. So we don't have any distractions. We're focusing just on the visual effects of the timber harvest practice. So You know, we spend summer sunny days walking around, and probably the most difficult part of the job then is to go home and keep a straight face and tell my wife that how hard a day I had at the office. Okay, what we do then with all of those images, we're in about the 4th generation of the surveys that we've developed, but this was one of the first surveys that we put together. And so what this has in the survey are these pictures of the different forest practices, and we send it out to these different respondents: foresters, recreationists, environmentalists, educators, and the general public. And this is to get an idea of, do we all see the same thing when we look at some of these forestry practices? And this is an example then of what these images actually look like, what the images would appear like in the survey. And you can see we have kind of our clear cut, the patch cut, the 2-age stand, the group selection, the commercial thin, and the control, which is no trees have been removed. Now the means down here, these are the scores for, if we average all of the, take everybody's scores, all of the people that responded, and we got the mean, we'd see that, okay, this is a 1.92. And the way this works is we show them this picture and we say, you don't like it very much, you give it a 1. You like it somewhat, you give it a 3. And you like it very much, you give it a 5. So you can see on a scale of 1 to 5, kind of the clear cut isn't everybody's favorite. And the control down here tends to be much higher. The commercial thin is pretty close to the control. And then the others fall kind of in between. Okay, so now this is what the question would be: do foresters who are going to implement this program see these practices the same way that we do? And in fact, what we discover here is that there are some differences. I mean, there is, you know, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. We do share a common understanding of what we like and what we don't like. And clearly in this particular case, I mean, relatively speaking, everybody likes the ones where there's more trees, and everybody kind of it decreases here. They seem to prefer less those where there are less trees. But what's interesting here is as we get more toward those more intensively managed practices, most everybody scores these with fewer trees quite low, whereas the foresters find them a little bit more acceptable. Okay, so this could be a problem in implementing the SFI initiative if indeed the forester goes out and says that, well, this particular practice where we've taken all the trees is quite all right, and everybody else is looking at it and says that doesn't seem to measure up to kind of these visual, minimizing the visual impacts that presumably SFI is talking about. So why is this the case? Well, I think this is important to point out too. The treatments as they were perceived by the respondents, why were the scenes rated the way they were? And we'll take the most intensive of those practices. This is a clear-cut scene, and we can see the mean for the foresters is about 3.17. All others are 1.72. So there's a pretty good difference there. The forester who is trained in the management, you recall what the statement of the SFI program is about: the growing, nurturing, harvesting of trees for products that you and I enjoy, with consideration for the conservation of air, water, etc., and aesthetics. So they're looking at this and saying that this is what it is that we are about. We grow, we nurture, and we harvest those trees, and this site demonstrates how that works. And they look at that from their expertise and say, good management, site utilization, forest progression. The rest of us who are not trained in forestry, who do not have that expertise, look at this with a little bit different view. And basically, we probably, or for the most part, some people see processes. They may discern things going on with regard to, somebody has mentioned erosion here, or there may be wildlife. But to a large extent, we're responding to the visual aspects, the arrangement of that space, and how that looks. So there's clearly a difference here in terms of how these areas are perceived. Now we've looked at that first plot that we did, the first study area, is close-up views, so that you're just looking into the forest. And we also wanted to see what happens when we have distant views. So our second study area has the same treatments, but they're on hillsides that we can get back from and capture these images. So this would be the scene maybe that you would see on the distant hillside when you were driving along the highway. We have the different sites here. We have the control at the top, patch cut. Under that, the clear cut. To the right, the group selection, and then the 2H. I didn't put the commercial thin in here because when you look at the commercial thin and the control, in spite of the fact that about 25% of the trees are removed, they don't look any different from each other. Well, what did we find here? We found pretty much the same thing that we found in the near views. Okay? There's that same difference between foresters and the other groups that we surveyed, and the line tends to go from keep most of the trees, you like it a lot, and then as you go down, people prefer it less. The only change of any consequence between the near view and the far view is that these two actually switch. In the near view, for some reason, people prefer this over the 2H stand. In the far view, I guess you can kind of see these openings a little bit more, and here you have a more continuous canopy, so their preference is for the 2H stand in the distant view as opposed to the group selection. Okay, now there's a couple of additional things that I think that we wanted to find out about. So our survey found out that there was this difference, that the foresters perceive these stands differently, especially the more intensive stands, than everybody else. Now this would be a problem if they didn't realize that there was a difference. Okay? So if you're implementing the SFI objective and you think that there's no problem with the clear cut, these intensive practices, because I think they're acceptable and I think that everybody else thinks they're acceptable. So one of the things that we wanted to find out, do you know or do you think like I think? And what we did was to ask a question. We said, also, we provided them with some information. I'll come back to that in a moment, but it said, also, how do you think these other general groups of people would rate the same scenes? Okay? And so we asked, how would you rate it? How would the forester rate it? How would the public rate it? And how would the environmentalists rate that? And so what we discovered, and this, it seems a little complex, but we'll walk through this one. It's kind of reassuring. This is what each of the different groups reported in terms of what they thought the others, how the others would probably rate these. Okay. Down here on the bottom, we have, this is the environmentalists in the blue circle, the foresters are the yellow square, the general public is they're the green diamond. Okay. Now we go up here and let's look at, this is how the foresters said other people would perceive these scenes. And because we know that the biggest difference is on the clear cuts, let's go over to the clear cut image. Okay? So this is how the foresters actually voted and said, this is how we prefer those scenes. And when they said, how do you think other foresters would view it? The foresters thought that other foresters would actually like it more than they actually do. They thought that the general public was down here, and they thought the environmentalists were down here. So this is kind of reassuring in the sense that they know that they like these things more than the public and the environmentalists do. Actually, they think that they like them more than they actually like them. We go over to the environment. Now, wait a minute. Now, if you're an environmentalist, you're going to get yours too, see? If the environmentalists over here, this is how they actually like these things. Not very much, but when asked how environmentalists like these, they overestimated how much they would dislike it, just like the foresters overestimated how much they would like it. And they had the foresters just about right and the general public in the middle. Now, interestingly enough, the general public thinks the general public would like it more, but they also have the environmentalists and the foresters just about right, okay? And in fact, the foresters and the environmentalists overestimate where the general public is. They're down here kind of about a 2, and they thought that the public would like these things more than they do. So this was kind of interesting in the sense that fortunately everybody had everybody generally where they actually are. And I think this is good in that the forester isn't going to go out and do something thinking that other people are going to like it when in fact they know full well that they're not going to get too excited about it. Now, we had one more piece of information that we were kind of interested in one of our surveys that we conducted was that, well, if they don't like these scenes, if you gave them some information about the benefits of these harvests, that maybe then that would raise their preference. So we decided to try an information intervention. And in this particular case, for each of these scenes that we have here, it's also, our visual study was done in conjunction with other studies that have been done out there in terms of the economic effects, the wildlife effects, the effects on soil, the residual damage to stands. We have a whole range of types of information so that we can see what it is that we trade off for these visually preferred landscapes. And so one of the things that the foresters in particular, the people from the Department of Natural Resources said, you know, if people knew that the revenue that comes off of the Department of Natural Resources timber harvests went for public school construction, which it does, okay, the money that comes, the money for this construction of some of the buildings here on campus in our public schools comes from revenue generated by the harvesting of trees. So we asked this specific question, okay, more than half the trees have been harvested from this site. The money that comes from the sale of these trees helps to support public school construction in Washington. So this was an economic piece of information. We also had biological information and we had physical information, and we randomly reordered these things for the different scenes, and so we were interested in whether or not information made a difference and whether or not the type of information made a difference. So with regard to that one question, it's kind of an interesting one. If you knew that the revenue from these trees is paid for your public schools, how would that affect your preference? Interestingly enough, it went down. Okay? It did not go, and actually in this particular case, this one is not statistically significant, but probably the more important thing is it didn't go up either. And I think there's probably a lot of other things going on there, but let's look at a couple of these other examples. The group selection as an example, okay? This one is one that generally is preferred by everybody, and for the most part, the environmentalists and the general public responded to all three kinds of information, the socioeconomic, the biological, and the physical information pertaining to this particular harvest practice. It raised the preference quite a bit, from 1 to 1.5 on this 5-point scale. Interestingly enough, all across the board, the foresters tended not to be influenced that much, and I think this probably has to do with the expertise that they bring to these particular preference ratings, is that you provide this information. Well, they already know a lot of that, and so that's a factor in how they rate them in the first place. But if we look over here in the clear cut, their ratings went up considerably higher than the environmentalists and not too much differently than the general public. And I think what it is that we can see here is that if you're predisposed to a particular harvest practice, you'll be more responsive to that information. If in the case of the environmentalists, who really were quite critical of the clear cuts, any amount of information is probably not going to change their preference rating very much. Okay? And even in the case of the general public, who were quite responsive over in the group selection, tended to be less so in the clear cut. So information will be helpful, but I think in those practices where there are the biggest differences, in all likelihood, that isn't going to make that much of a difference. Well, visual resource management. In this case, in the Sustainable Forestry Objective, we find that the American Forest and Paper Association Board has determined that visual resources are an important element in this SFI initiative. But we've discovered that while there is broad agreement across a diverse set of people regarding a variety of forest practices, there is a difference when it comes to those more intensive practices, when all the trees are removed, when the area has been clear cut. In these cases, foresters find these practices more acceptable while the rest of the population does not like them. And this can be generally attributed to the role that expertise plays in people's perceptions. And in the case of the forester, they see the more utilitarian aspects of these landscapes, while the others responding to these landscapes see kind of the more aesthetic aspects of those settings. So not unlike our rural character discussion, the successful implementation of the principles and objectives of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, especially as it pertains to visual resource management, depends on seeking input from a wide range of interested parties. And again, like our rural character case, it's important to note that our visual surveys seem to be, at least in part, a fairly effective tool in tapping people's preferences for the visual quality of our forest settings. Let's go to our third case, the Lake Tahoe Regional Plan. And in this particular case, as I indicated, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency was established in 1970 after much concern about a lot of the development that was going on around the Lake Tahoe Basin and the threat to the quality, the water quality of that area. And it's an area of some significance. Actually, Lake Tahoe, because it's high elevation lake, very clear, very deep, 1,600 feet deep, it's comparable to only a couple of other lakes on the face of the earth, Lake Tahoe, Crater Lake, and Lake Baikal in the Soviet Union. So this is not just something of local concern or regional concern. It's an area of global significance. So this agency was created, and its purpose was to develop land use and environmental plans to protect the water, the vegetation, the wildlife, and the scenic quality of this area. Those were the intentions of Congress. Much of the landscape is administered by the U.S. Forest Service in public ownership, but there is a reasonable percentage in the private ownership, and it's the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency that has the responsibility for developing these regulations on those other lands. Okay, and in this particular case, the scenic threshold, this is what we want to focus on in terms of that element of their planning efforts. This is trying to get at the desired future condition of the scenic quality of the built environment. And this particular study was looking at the views from the roadway and the shoreline. And the scenic threshold talks about ensuring that the height, bulk, texture, form, you know, if you're trying to get a permit, this would drive you nuts, I'm sure. The height, bulk, texture, form, materials, colors, lighting, signing, and other design elements of the new, remodeled, and redeveloped buildings be compatible with the natural, scenic, and recreation values of the region. What this is saying is that development in the Lake Tahoe Basin should fit with the natural setting so as not to detract from the scenic values that are there. Now, the strategy that they have pursued here is that the planners base their program and assessment on standards established by a panel of scenic experts. Now, this is interesting and different than the previous two cases. In the previous two cases, we have the policymaker, and then we have in the case of the Growth Management Act, the planner, who may or may not be trained in visual resource management. And in the case of SFI, we have the policymakers and then the forester, who may or may not be trained in visual resource management. In this particular case, we have the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, the planners who are going to implement this scenic purpose, and they figure that they don't have the expertise, and so they establish a panel of scenic experts whose expertise is in the visual design arts, landscape architecture, those kinds of things. So over the years, they have developed this program in the Lake Tahoe Basin. And only recently, because there's been more development and these regulations have been imposed on this new development, people are saying, you know, do these scenic experts, do they really, I mean, is this just, you know, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, or indeed does their expertise reflect the same preference that the public has for these kinds of scenic landscapes? So that was the question: do the standards developed by experts match a cross-section of the public's understanding of what is scenic? So the governing board posed this question to the planners, and the planners said, we've never tested this before. And so this was a nice opportunity then for us. And how this came about was that the agency put out a request for a proposal to do this study to basically validate their approach to the scenic management. And a private consulting firm in Tempe, a fellow that worked there, had taken a class many, many years ago from two people at the University of Michigan, Rachel and Steve Kaplan, who are experts in environmental psychology, visual preference studies, those kinds of things. And Carl asked Rachel and Steve, are you interested in this? And they said, well, yeah, we could probably do it, but we'd like to. And so they called and asked Ann Carney and myself, would you join up on this project? And we did. And the firm got the deal. And then we got to spend time at Lake Tahoe. And it's interesting, the firm is called Logan Simpson Design, and on their business card it says LSD Incorporated. Now, if you think it was tough coming out of Capitol Forest, convincing my wife how hard it was at work, but to say, I'm going to be working with LSD high in the Sierra, there's challenges to this job. So here was what we put together was, as we have done before, using these visual preference surveys, we put these together looking at the roadside scenes. So here we have a collection of roadside scenes and lake shore scenes. And again, being the nice guy that I am, I drove around the whole lake and took pictures, and then I got on a boat and spent another day going around the lake taking pictures. So it was tough. And one of the things we wanted to find out right off the bat was, as this whole study began, it was actually, not everybody agreed that it should be done, and there was some real skeptics here. The developers said, well, certainly the environmentalists and these other people are going to come in and overwhelm the surveys, and they'll outvote us. And then the environmentalists were saying this is just going to be one more forum for these adversarial kinds of battles, and nothing's going to come of it. And we all disagree on really whether the scenic objective is important. So we threw that in the survey for starters. And so right off the bat, you can see all of the different groups here. We have the environmental interests, the business, chamber of commerce, property owners, the locals, the tourists. These are all the people that we sampled. We made sure that all of the interests were represented as respondents in the survey. And everybody, it's a high level of concern for the current scenic resources and concern for future scenic resources. Everybody rates this high. Some a little bit higher than others, but you can see everybody is on board in terms of the importance of the scenic resources to the Lake Tahoe area. Now, we looked at, like I said, the lake shore areas and the roads. Now, this is kind of interesting here, where they said there would be all these differences. Here we have the screened single family, which are these scenes, the visible single family, which is this scene, and the condominium, which is this scene. Okay, these are all the different people that responded to the survey. Okay, they all had the same relative order of preference for each of these scenes, whether or not you were a realtor or an environmentalist, a tourist, or everything in between. The screened single family was preferred over the visible single family over the condominiums. Okay? Within these, you can see there is some variation. The board of realtors were a bit more accommodating on some of these developments. The environmentalists were a little bit more critical on some others. But the relative preference for each of these different scenes was the same across all of these groups. And what's important here, remember the regulations talking about height, bulk, color, texture, buffering, all those kinds of things. The built environment fits in the landscape. These are exactly the kinds of landscapes that the scenic experts are recommending and are embodied in the regulations that they are putting together. Same thing is true when we had the road scenes. We have basically three different images here. This is what we call kind of the nature scene. This was the large-scale development, and this was the small-scale development. Again, the relative preference is the same. People prefer those scenes where you can't see a lot of the built activity near the road. As it pertains to the large and the small-scale development, everybody except the Chamber of Commerce and the Board of Realtors are pretty much even on those types of development. Now, within each of these categories, there's a range of kinds of developments, and it's important to show these so that you can see what it is that the scenic experts are trying to get at. Those kinds of developments that fit a little bit better because of their cut, color, texture, signage, and those kinds of things, as opposed to those that are less buffered, colors stand out, and those that are unbuffered at all, and these happen to be some of the older developments. But you can see even in the large-scale developments, there are opportunities in this new development near the state line of California and Nevada. New development, nicely done in terms of the materials that would fit into the natural environment, a little bit more intrusive, and then some of the very old ones which bear really no relation to the surrounding landscape. So what we would hope is that when somebody goes to the Lake Tahoe area and they're out there enjoying this scenery that they expected to find when they came there, that not only would they find it out in these remote Forest Service lands, but when they visited the recreation areas around the lake, when they toured the shoreline, or when they traveled the roads and passed the commercial businesses, that they would also be able to enjoy some of the scenic character of the basin there at the same time. So in the case of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and the scenic thresholds, what the Congress intended with regard to scenery management and what the public seems to be getting meshes pretty well. The standards that were developed were consistent with the broad population preference for landscapes that capture the scenic qualities of the Lake Tahoe Basin. Why this happened, of course, is because there was a match between the expertise of the scenic panel and the work that they were empowered to do, and that is to assist in the development of the scenic thresholds. That expertise kind of match that of the rest of the public. And of course, as we've mentioned in the previous cases, it's useful to note that the visual survey, again, can be part of an effective tool in tapping people's preference for scenic qualities, as it was in the case of the Lake Tahoe Basin. And I think it was particularly important here because in most of the other environments where different groups were brought together to discuss issues of planning with TRPA, they were very contentious. And this one tended to bring more people together, quite objective, and it's hard to argue with the results. And I think for many of the people, they were rather pleased with how it actually turned out. Well, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, but it's not such an individual thing after all. For the most part, we do share a common understanding of what we like and what we do not like. And where there are differences, it's very important to tap into people's preferences to assure that those scenic qualities of the landscape that we value find their way into our land use plans and programs. And it's also important for policymakers not to assume that their visual management goals will automatically be translated into scenic landscapes. They must ensure that those responsible for implementing those goals have a clear sense of what the viewing public actually wants and that the programs that they put in place actually reflect those preferences. I ran across this quote recently, Thomas Jefferson to Richard Henry Lee, saying, "The opinions and dispositions of our people in general, which in governments like ours must be the foundation of measures, will always be interesting to me." I think that this was probably as true today as it was a couple of hundred years ago. So with that, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. I would also like to again acknowledge my colleagues that work with me on these projects: Ann Carney, Jenna Tiltar, Eric Snellwager. Cecilia Paul is here as a director of communications. She actually made sure that I did a PowerPoint that was, if you like this, it was her. If there were parts you didn't like, that was my fault. Also, money supports these kinds of projects, and funding for these projects came from the U.S. Forest Service, the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, the National Science Foundation, our IGRT program in urban ecology, and the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. So thank you again.